Light is obviously very important for plants, not only because it's how they photosynthesize, but it also gives them cues as to the seasons. And so light cues often play important roles in growth and development, and the effects of light on plant morphology are called photomorphogenesis. It's not simply the presence or absence of light that's important, it's also the wavelength of light, so the frequency, and this leads to something called an action spectrum, which is essentially a graph that shows you the response of the plant to different wavelengths of light. Here at the top you can see an action spectrum, and below you can see kind of what's happening in the plant with each of these light spectra, and you can see that the action spectrum shows the blue wavelengths kind of in this mid 400 nanometers wavelength. There's a lot more action, phototropic effectiveness, and you can see that physically down here by the bending of the plant in blue light. Plants, like animals, are able to detect different frequencies of light, different wavelengths of light, by having photosensitive molecules, usually proteins. And they have blue-sensitive pigments, but they also have red-sensitive pigments that shift their shape depending on whether there's a presence of red light or far red light, which is an even lower frequency. These pigments that detect reddish light are usually called phytochromes, and they can give information about the quality of light, because if you're in the shade, you tend to receive more far red light than you do red light, and so plants will often have a shade avoidance response. If there's a lot of shade, the phytochrome ratio will shift in favor of PR instead of PFR. Here again, you can see those different shapes, right? In shade, PFR will change shape into PR, and when there's direct sunlight, PR will shift to PFR. Also, like animals, a lot of plants have circadian rhythms, which means a rhythm, a clock that kind of goes along with the day. And their processes might be different in the morning than they are in the evening or at night or versus during the day. For instance, a lot of legumes will lower their leaves in the evening, raise them in the morning to affect their sunlight absorption. You may be familiar with morning glory flowers, which open up in the morning and close up in the afternoon. Here you can see an example of a plant with its leaves up at noon, so it's catching that sunshine, and its leaves down at midnight where there's no sunshine to be caught. These rhythms are called circadian rhythms because they take about 24 hours, about a day, and they provide an internal clock. And the mechanism is a little unknown, but it may be a protein that is produced and then broken down in a cycle that takes about 24 hours, and that rhythm is usually affected by cues, feedback cues like daylight and absence of daylight to keep that circadian clock effective. These clocks sometimes have to be checked with external cues in the same way that you might have a battery-powered clock that sits on your desk that may occasionally run a little fast or a little slow, and you realize it's a few minutes off from your phone, which is on satellite time, and you have to change it. Your internal circadian clock, circadian rhythm, may run a little off and have to get some feedback in the form of sunrises and sunsets, for instance, to keep it running accurately. Plants also have some sense of the calendar, right? The annual clock, and they use photoperiod frequently for that because longer days and shorter nights tend to mean summer, and longer nights and shorter days tend to mean winter. And photoperiod is more accurate than temperature, for instance, which is also important, and they also use. But you can have hot snaps and cold snaps, but the length of the days is pretty standard. Some plants that may flower, for instance, later in the summer are called short day plants because they flower when the light period is below a certain length. And some are long day plants, meaning they flower when the day becomes longer than a certain cutoff length. And some are day neutral, and they are just controlled. They're flowering by plant maturity, and it has no reliance on photoperiod. Humans have recognized this for a long time, that some plants tend to flower as the days get longer or shorter, but in the 40s, researchers realized that it seemed like they were responding to long and short days, but really they were responding to long and short nights. In other words, if you are a short day plant, really you're a long night plant, and it's the minimum number of hours of darkness that stimulates you to flower. If you're a long day plant, you're really a short night plant, and it's a number of hours of darkness that dictates your flowering. How did biologists figure this out? Well, they did experiments where they would create a flash of light in the middle of the period of darkness that essentially, it didn't change the length of the day, but it did break up the length of the darkness into two smaller chunks. And so if you are a short day plant, then during a long night, short day, you flower, long day, short night, you don't. But if you have the same short day and your long night is broken up by a flash of light, you don't flower, right? So it really seems to be this length of night. Similarly, if you are a long day, short night plant, right? Long day, short night, you flower, short day, long night, you don't. But if it's still a short day and you break up that long night, well, then really it's two short nights and you end up flowering. So we talk about them as long day and short day plants, but really they are short night and long night plants. Some plants will flower after a single exposure to that required night length. Others will need several days in a row of that kind of photoperiod before they flower. And others, in addition to the photoperiod, need certain other environmental stimuli, like vernalization. This is the idea of cold treatment. Apples, for instance, need a certain number of cold days, it's called, before they will respond to a photoperiod to flower. And this is why you don't find apples growing in San Diego or Florida, right? You don't get enough cold days. I lived for a while in San Diego County, but up in the mountains where we did get a winter because of the altitude. And we were, regionally famous for apples and apple pies because we were the only place in a long, long way that anyone could actually grow apples and get fresh apples for pie. Leaves seem to be what detects this photoperiod. Again, long days or short days, but really long nights or short nights. And the mechanism is a signal called phloragen. So this is a flowering signal. It comes from the leaves when the photoperiod is correct and stimulates flowering. And it seems to be governed by something called the flowering locus T, or FT gene. And this was discovered when people did experiments where they would take a short day plant and a long day plant, right, and give them short days so that the short day plant is going to flower. But they'd graft the long day plant onto the short day plant, where conceivably it's getting the chemical signals that are coming from these leaves, and it flowers, right? You end up getting the long day flower when it's grafted onto the short day plant, and it's getting the same chemical signals. Plants don't just respond to light, they also respond to other environmental cues like gravity. And growth in response to gravity is called gravitropism. If you grow toward the gravity, like roots do, you show positive gravitropism. If you grow away from the gravity, like shoots do, you show negative gravitropism. And they detect this in a way that's pretty similar to animals in that they have very often cytoplasmic components, molecules that are heavy, called statoliths, that fall in response to gravity. And that's how the plant detects which way is down and which way is up. And in this image, you can actually see the statoliths inside the plant cell, and they're down here, right? And this would have been facing down, but if you turn it on its side like this, those statoliths are going to fall to the bottom here, and they're going to stimulate growth in that direction, because again, roots show positive gravitropism. There are some plants that don't have statoliths, but still are able to show gravitropism. And it's thought that they use dense organelles instead of statoliths that sink in response to gravity to tell them which way is up and which way is down. So they also can show positive gravitropism. And this is a lot like animals, which show gravitaxis or phototaxis, or gravikinesis or photokinesis, right? But phototaxis is movement toward or away from light. Phototropism is growth toward or away from light. Growth in response to mechanical stimuli, so physically touching, is called thigmotropism or thigmomorphogenesis are physical changes that happen in response to touching. So thigmo is going to refer to mechanical stimuli. So sometimes rubbing stems of young plants a couple times a day can cause them to be shorter than controls. And here's an example of that thigmomorphogenesis, right? Touched a couple times a day, it remains short. It has a different morphology than your typical plant. Some plants show positive thigmotropism. They grow towards touch. For instance, climbing plants, things like vines. If they grow and they feel touch, right, they're going to grow around wherever they felt that touch in the same direction. Other plants, like Mimosa pudica, are able to move quickly. So instead of growing tropism in direction or away from the direction of touch, they fold quickly because they're actually able to have action potentials. They send electrical impulses like animals do, even though they don't have what you would call a nervous system. It's possible you may have seen plants like this before. You touch them, and again, very quickly they fold in like that, and it's because they send an electrical signal that causes cells to become turgid on one side, and that causes them to bend. It's really pretty remarkable, this kind of fast response in a plant. We don't tend to associate with plants. Plants also respond to stresses. They could be abiotic or non-living stresses, things like salinity or drought or heat stress or cold stress, or they could be biotic stresses like herbivores or pathogens. In drought, a lot of plants will avoid water loss by reducing transpiration, by closing up stomata or slowing leaf growth, because having big fat leaves means a lot of surface area for sun to hit. They may stimulate the growth of deeper roots so they can find water lower in the soil and inhibit the growth of shallower roots that have not been successful at finding water. Alternatively, in flooding, they may actually destroy cells in the root cortex, and that creates air tubules that can help plants survive when they have oxygen deprivation, which is a big risk during flooding, because again, plant roots aren't producing oxygen through photosynthesis, but they still need to undergo cellular respiration. They need oxygen, and so they can drown. And here's a look at a typical root that you would see in aerated soil. And in experimental non-aerated soil, you can see these giant tubes that were formed by destroying some of these cells. Really salty soil can also be stressful because there's not that water potential to draw water into the roots. And so some plants will respond by producing their own solutes, which are less toxic to them than sodium, for instance, and creating them in large amounts inside the plant to maintain that difference in water potential to keep water coming in. Most plants can't survive salt stress for very long, but some are adapted to it, the ones that live, near the ocean, for instance. Much like in animals, plants can't deal with extreme heat for very long either, because excessive heat can denature a plant's enzymes, which means their metabolic processes can't go forward. And so plants, like animals, will create heat shock proteins which help maintain the shape of their other important enzymes in the response to heat. In response to cold, they can adjust the lipid composition of membranes to keep membranes from becoming too solid. They want to maintain fluidity, and so you might create more fatty acids that are unsaturated, for instance, or adjust the amount of cholesterol in your membrane. And then sometimes they even produce antifreeze proteins to prevent ice from crystallizing inside the cell and damaging those cells. Biological stressors can include pathogens, and plants can respond to pathogens sort of like animals can. They have molecules that can fight them off. They also occasionally will have, for instance, hypersensitive reaction is going to cause individual bits of tissue like leaves to fall off to prevent the pathogen from spreading within the body, or sometimes they'll make silicic acid, which is going to be a cry for help to other parts of the tissue to help out. In response to herbivory, plants can make chemicals that are toxic to the herbivore, some of which we now find tasty, things that are like bitter in plants, like coffee, for instance, caffeine. Those chemicals are defense chemicals. But sometimes they'll also send chemicals to individuals of a different species and cry for help. So some plants will send chemical signals through the air to get parasitoid wasps to come and then lay eggs in the herbivore, in this case, a caterpillar, that will kill it.